boys must be hungry. I'm real surprised to see you down here.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work, or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street. There's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe. Our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.
Peace and blessings to you all. Welcome. We're back here at the Wake Up Show with yours truly, episode 5. Yeah, how has progressivism failed Gen Z? I think this is a very, very important discussion here. In a sense, building off of our previous episodes and ideas, now taking a deeper look at the current generational crisis we have. And Gen Z is so important. They really are. They're so important because they are going to be the future families, parents, shapers of society. Right. So it's very important to address their dilemmas, their crises, try to figure out how we got here and what we possibly could do to change things moving forward. What can we do in our day-to-day lives, right? What can we do in our communities and societies? What type of real world application can we consider given the direction of things? Because there's a lot of stuff we have no control over, right? As far as the technologies being developed, the mass societal and industrial changes, politics, warfare, all of these things that are way beyond our control in our own personal worlds. So let's talk about it, man. Good to see you guys. Gonna jump right in here. So first, I want to start off with this idea of the failures, right? Let's really touch on the specific failures of progressivism. And it isn't to say that all of our issues are rooted in progressive ideology and politics, but they definitely have been a catalyst and are a major contributor to this, mixed with other things. So we'll be touching on those as well. So let's first start with the progressive failures. Overall, I have to look at progressivism. Well, first off, really, what is progressivism? That could take a whole lot of time to really break down, in that it has so many different meanings to different people in different contexts, right? But there's the progressivism, I guess, industrial progressivism concerning modernism that wants to do social reform, create equality in the world. There's the technological progressivism that says human progress is technological progress, right? So there's an industrial version of progressivism. There's a historical version of progressivism. What we're focusing on here is more of the political version of progressivism, the cultural version of progressivism, which we could look at something that got its start around post-World War II by way of intellectual movements mixed with a progressive politics, specifically with, I guess, one of the first individuals to really kick this off was Woodrow Wilson, but we saw this really get its shine with FDR, and then taken even further by LBJ. And I guess what this type of progressivism could be called, or at least we could look at it as socio-political and cultural. So there's a policy aspect to it that comes from liberalism mixed with the economic neoliberalism, and then the cultural and ideological progressive ideas of, say, the Frankfurt School and postmodern intellectualism. So when I'm talking about progressivism with these shows and these ideas, I'm coming from that lens, not necessarily historical progressivism that is rooted in the modernist idea of man making progress in the world through his technologies and reason, kind of this Enlightenment idea of progress, not that progress, and not this type of techno-deterministic progress that suggests human progress is technological progress. Now, those play a role, sure, especially the industrial technological version, but we're focusing more so on the purely cultural, ideological, as well as political concept of progressivism. I look at progressivism in that sense as regressive. It's a regression. And today I'll try to cover what I mean by what is it regressing to, right? And further, well, I guess the regression idea would be more of a political view, historical view, maybe even anthropological view, right? As we're going back to more base levels of our humanness, we're going back to a more animalistic type of interactivity, the loins, the flesh. But then there's transgression, which I look at as more of a theological view opposed to anthropological. It's transgressing the absolute, the transcendent truths of God. So transgression in this sense is spiritual. And then how has progressivism failed Gen Z? Ultimately, it's a regressive and transgressive movement that has decentered and destabilized and dehumanized this generation. Now, all generations have experienced this. Progressivism didn't start, in 2012, but it is this integration of highly sophisticated and developed, influential and powerful technologies that could contribute to this level of decentering. So and these are some main issues here: a preoccupation with identity, pleasures, and political change at the expense of social cohesive building blocks. So it is my view that progressivism has failed Gen Z in many ways, but to keep things pretty simple, the movement has failed Gen Z by getting the generation to forget about some of the cohesive building blocks that makes life worth living, that allows and accounts for love and selflessness, transcendence, the metaphysical, all of these kind of philosophical ideas, as well as the relating aspects of humanness. right? Face-to-face conversation and presence and sincerity. Things like vulnerability, things like intimacy, right? These are cohesive building blocks that make life worth living and account for and allow for love and relationships and connection, not communication, connection, right? So the progressive movement has allowed for these cohesive building blocks to fade away in the background, whilst identity, preoccupation with pleasures, and preoccupation with changing the world through politics takes the foreground. These become the most important things for the generation. Identity, how they view themselves in relation to their group, the pleasures they seek in the world whilst avoiding pains, of course. It's kind of hedonistic thing. And then political change. Everyone's so political now. The politicizing life, as we looked at yesterday. Politicization is such a hard word to say. The politicization of life, right? It's very clever because when you make everything political, who controls politics? State, government, corporate entities, plutocracy, private-public partnerships. If you want to control everything, make everything political, right? So in my view, this is a big part of why and how this all really happened. Okay, so next. Building off of the concept or the term decentering, with this dynamic of hyper fixation on identity, pleasures, and political change, you get a decentering effect. A decentering effect. We get away from ourselves, the things that center and ground our being, right? Family, God, identity, self, love, relationships, right? Selflessness, right? Interactivity, vulnerability, all these things that center us in the world and as a person, because we're only a person insofar as we're related to other persons. Once we decenter all of those things, we're freed up to the flesh, right? We're given up to the machine. And then we hyper focus on our identity through narcissism, right? We hyper focus on pleasure through whether it be, scrolling, prawn addiction, video gaming, constant stimulation, external stimulation. And then of course, we focus on things like political change to give us some meaning, to kind of create some grander vision or meta narrative, to give us some purpose in life outside of just purely pleasuring oneself. Okay. Are we ready for this one yet? Let's see. Let's bring it back here. Got a bunch of different things to show, so I'm going to try to keep up with all of this and stay within the time period I have allotted for these shows. So it's interesting when I think about progressivism and its failures, right? Because it's decentered, it's destabilized, and it's created a disease in the culture, a disease that I call narcissism, this kind of disease of the flesh, right? Atomized by way of the phones and social media and living detached and this type of vicarious spectatorship everyone has when it comes to the world and events through, screens and social media trends and virality, just taking us away from our humanness and that which makes life real. And it's funny how the goal was originally, when we look at Gramsci, when we look at a lot of the postmodern thinkers and the intellectuals, their whole claim was, to make the world a better place, to create community and to make things more collective and social. What we need to do is destabilize and decenter and create disease within the capitalist system. We have to decenter and destabilize the capitalist patriarchal culture, right? But what I find fascinating is it ended up not being simply capitalism or patriarchal culture, but it actually ended up being humanity itself. They ended up through their progressive ideologies and policies and programming. They actually decentered and destabilized humanity. and civilization. So it's so fascinating to me to see how over time, because this has been, I mean, last 100 years, this progressive movement has dictated the direction of at least America. And of course, America being this kind of cultural factory to the world, it's happened across the earth, save China and Russia, maybe some other places. So it's interesting how the whole postmodern progressive move was to decenter capitalism and culture, but they ended up actually decentering humanity and civilization as we know it. And now we're dealing with the consequences. And they're trying to cloud all of this with silly politics, the left versus right, Trump versus the world kind of scenario, Trump versus the deep state. This just political, just constant inundation of crisis, whilst the issues at hand, the problems, in my view, are actually very simple. They come down to our personal selves and our lives and our personal surroundings and in our day to day. The day to day has been usurped by the screen to screen, if you will, and it gives us this false sense of reality, this just total false sense of reality, to where everything we see on these screens and all the goings on, all the big numbers and all of that shapes our perspective and our perception, and in that we lose sight of what's really going on around us. So there is this decentering effect that has directly damaged Generation Z, and it's not just Generation Z. We're all damaged by this, even the boomers, right? All of us have been affected negatively. Not to say there hasn't been any redeeming qualities or positive aspects of these technologies and these new forms of communication. We've discussed that, but I think it's important to focus on the things that need fixing. A lot of people want to focus on the positive. Oh, we need to be more positive about what's going on. I think that's silly. I think that's just lying to yourself, right? I think we need to realize what's actually happening and try to figure out ways we can fix things, at least in our own lives, to our best abilities. Now, the reason Gen Z is so important, though we've all been flawed, Gen Z has experienced the most damage due to the fact that they were born into this system. They don't have an equilibrium or balancing effect that maybe some of us older people have, because we've experienced this pre-social media life, this pre-smartphone, this pre-device paradigm lifestyle. So we have to focus on this generation because they embody these decentering effects. They embody the progressive failure, right? They live it out. And they're also dictating the future based on their behaviors and their choices for over the next 20, 30 years. So it's something to consider. All right, let me see where this is an example of what I mean. Causing the generations to become purely political, right? So everyone's an activist now. All these activists, Gen Zers, screaming and crying about political issues far beyond their control, and in most cases completely outside of their direct experiences in life. You have these kids being brought together, mobilized in the university system. And some of these kids live in completely different states that have nothing to do with some of these issues. Good to see you, Brother Reg. It says, how close are bipolar and narcissism intertwined? They're very different, right? If we're going to look at like DSM definitions, but they're very similar. I'll say this: all outside of possibly, actually no, pretty much all cluster. Well, they're both cluster B, so we could put them under the cluster B umbrella. All cluster B issues have features of narcissism, but narcissism does not necessarily have features of a bipolar type of disorder, right? So narcissism has to do, at its base, there's many different views on it for many different people, and they tend to be incorrect most of the time. A lot of people focus on narcissism as this inflated sense of self, but at its root, it's actually an underdeveloped and unstable sense of self. It's compensatory. Narcissism is inherently an issue of compensatory behavior, to create a false self that can present or provide one some sense of esteem, if you will. We'll talk about esteem today, or value, right? Bipolar is more of it's more of a mood issue that has to do with irrational thinking, that has to do with splitting and extremes. It's kind of an up and down mood imbalance issue. Now, there can be narcissistic features in bipolar disorder, as far as they view themselves in a narcissistic way, where it's all about me. My emotions are the only emotions that matter. I'm going to go into social environments and act out based on, whatever I'm going through emotionally, and I'm going to completely disregard the room and the public in general. Yeah, borderline is a whole other story. Borderline is a lot deeper than bipolar. Bipolar is actually misdiagnosed. It's a strange, and again, I don't adhere to the DSM and these very objective, standardized forms of disorders. I think they're completely flawed. I think they're metrics or rubrics designed to fund industry and to quantify and instrumentalize human psychology. I personally think it's an extremely flawed system that is rooted in an industry. It's about industrializing psychic patterns that are deemed pathological. That's my view, personally. I don't believe though there's use, right, as far as some of the features and the symptoms. I just think this rubric or metric that they use to qualify a value of, or at least quantify a particular set of behaviors as this one thing is crazy. And I don't think they really understand how these things develop anyways, especially when we consider their solutions, which are psychiatric pharmaceuticals, which is the worst thing you could do. But anyhow, I'm ranting here. They're very, very different, though. Bipolar disorders is pretty much a mood disorder. Narcissism is more of a personality issue. It's more so rooted in the self. Bipolar is more of a imbalance in mood and extreme emotional responses to mood. Yeah. Well, I'll be pulling out some more of my psych stuff on, because we used to do a lot of that stuff on this backup channel. So I'll definitely be jumping into some of that stuff more often, because it's relevant, and I think it does a good job at describing issues of the flesh. Right. I really think it does. Now, let's continue here. Okay, so this idea of politicizing life. So what you do is you make the youth revolutionaries. You turn them into you turn them into activists, overzealous, hyper emotional. Keep them upset, keep them angry, and keep them confused. This has been a major problem with progressivism. People need to learn how to relate to each other and relate to themselves. People need meaning, right? People need something to believe in that's transcendent, that's beyond themselves, right? Not something that's state-based, man-based. So it's just taking away all the most important things from an entire generation and normalizing it. So here, there's a preoccupation with identity, pleasures, and political change at the expense of social cohesive building blocks, making life purely political and pleasure-based and virtually unlivable. It's an unlivable life. It's truly an unlivable life to be purely political and pleasure-based. And what I mean by unlivable is it's misery. It's a constant state of conflict, zero-sum game, endless battles, right? When everything is just political and pleasure-based. It's a fool's errand, these kind of worldly political pursuits. And just the pleasure-based aspect of things is is unfortunate because it turns people into these types of machines, these kind of Pavlovian or Skinnerian machines that can be controlled by the push of buttons, right? Giving them their goodies and their treats. Now, these are some of the three main issues that, in my view, and again, none of this is exhaustive. I'm just trying to focus on things that are pretty basic and general, such that we can make generalizations. I understand there's always exceptions, right? There's always even the inverse example, but those are more outliers. Those are more exceptional. I'm trying to focus on the rules here, kind of the generalizations of things that we all see, not just on the internet, but even in the real world, though the internet exaggerates it quite a bit. Just because we see it everywhere on the internet doesn't mean it's necessarily real or it's happening everywhere in the world. But it still makes an effect psychologically. Many people might not live out some of these things, but they believe them. They're just inhibited, right? Because there's just this timidity in the culture today, especially the Gen Z. They're just very timid, right? And there's this asociality where there's a social angst, social anxiety. They're afraid, in a sense. There's a fear. So these are the three things I see: sex and gender, right? Race and racialism, and eros and eroticism. Three key parts of this generation, at least their programming, literal programming by way of politics, media, culture, literal programming. Key parts of sex and gender is human dimorphism, right? The difference, say, between sex, and the differences as far as behavioral pattern that is applied to the sex. Human dimorphism or sexual dimorphism, that which makes us different as men and women. Next, race and racialism, human diversity. Race or ethnicity as the diversity of human beings. The diversity of human beings at a racial or ethnic level being used as some type of base for conflict, base for problem, base for discourse or discord. Now, it's true. There's a racial history. There's been all types of oppression and all these historical things. But my view is it's not to say these things aren't legitimate in some capacity, but they're being leveraged. They're being exploited to actually distract, dissenter, and confuse a generation of people, getting them preoccupied with these ideas. It isn't to say these ideas don't have relevance or meaning in our lives. Of course, they play key roles in our identities. They're aspects of the way we relate to others. They give us difference. How can someone be black without someone being white? Right? These things give us meaning as different through difference. But it's the preoccupation and it's the exaggeration and the exploitation, the hyperbolic nature, all of these things that destroys the true meaning in these things and actually where they stand in our lives. Are they that important that we need to live our lives through these things? Now, eros and eroticism, right? Pleasure, the human passions, right? Things like sex and food, right? And emotional niceties, right? Things that feel good. Main things that have, in my view, really messed up this generation, the preoccupation with these things. So with that, we get identity, right? Identity is not bad. Pleasures and passions are not inherently bad or evil. But when pathologically applied, when identity is pathologically applied, we get narcissistic features. When pleasures and passions are pathologically applied, we get abject hedonism. Hedonism, Greek philosophical movement of different flavors, right? There's been different versions of this, from Epicurus to others that have a different view. Epicurus tended to put more of a moral stint or a moral bent on hedonism, opposed to prior forms of hedonism that were rooted purely in just seeking pleasure for the sake of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So we don't have to get into the details of hedonism. We could just look at hedonism as the pursuit in life is about pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain as much as possible. From this hedonistic Greek philosophy, we would eventually get something called utilitarianism, right? Which leads into pragmatism, which would say we need the the highest level of good for the most people in utilitarianism, right? This idea of the utility of life and people and actions. We avoid pain, we avoid oppression, we avoid inequality, we avoid all of these kind of I guess ways of disrespecting humanity by giving as much good as possible. That comes out of hedonism. But when pleasures and passions are pathological, we get abject hedonism, such that it does the opposite. It's like eating too much candy, right? Having too much sex. It's the opposite will happen. Your pursuit of this pleasure will end up killing you, literally. Now, let's define pathological just so we have a base. Of or relating to pathology, relating to or caused by disease, of relating to or manifesting behavior that is habitual, maladaptive, and compulsive. This is like the main thing here. For me, relating to or manifesting behavior that is habitual, maladaptive, and compulsive. When I'm using pathology, I'm focusing on this. Though there is a disease element, when we say maladaptive, I believe it's a disease. This maladaptation to life and what we do day to day, it's a disease. It causes pain. It could cause death, right? Having too much pleasure, being preoccupied with politics can create a disease in the mind. Depression, anxiety, all of these things. An example would be a pathological liar, right? Just want to define some of these things. Now, let's see where we at. Okay. What's next? Pathology. So now let's get into some of these clips. Start breaking down some of these ideas. So we talked a little bit, just briefly, about the failures of progress. I thought I had a list here. Hold on one second. Okay, so the failures. Realistically, the failures have to do with, so let's just, sex and gender, for instance. The sex and gender is important because what it's done is getting people to focus on their sex or their gender, their orientation or their identification. It weakened and demonized masculine identity, right? So it hurt girls and boys, men and women have been hurt through this progressivism, right? Through this progressivism. So the masculine identity was weakened and demonized, right? This kind of anti-patriarchal, histrionic feminism, right? That wants to invert the power structure opposed to actually create some form of equality or kind of create connection in a way that's pure and true and not oppressive. That's never been the goal. It's always been to just beat down men for the most part. And what this does is it disrupts the natural and cohesive features that bond man and women. So when we get this dynamic of sex and gender, they want to mess with human dimorphism and start to question, is there a binary? Is there any difference? Oh, is there really any difference between a man and a woman? A man shouldn't be the head of a household, or let's just say the leader in the dynamic. The woman should be on top or the powerful one or what have you. What this does is it disrupts the natural cohesive features that bond man and woman. I personally believe the natural and transcendent, because God has given us a hierarchy. God has given us a hierarchy to work from. It's not just nature and biology that would suggest these things, though you can make those arguments. Absolutely, you can make those arguments, but it's also, I think, inherently something God has handed down to us for structure and guidance. Now, this exacerbates atomization, right? This makes people more distant. This makes people more hyper-focused on themselves. It makes people more narcissistic. When men and women can't get along or not interested in each other because there's this low trust and there's this kind of like animosity or this just liminal hatred, this subtle hatred for each other. It just makes everyone go inside or go homosexual in many cases, or go pansexual, or get addicted to a toy or something. So it just makes the whole atomization thing worse and enables it, encourages it, but then it pushes people right to the devices. It pushes people right to the machines, right to the toys, right to the autoeroticism. Oh, I don't need you anyway. I got my toy at home, or, I'll do this or I'll do that. You're replaceable. This whole idea. This is what progressivism has brought to the gender dynamic, is strife and misrepresentation, manipulation, all these things. So with that, we get autoeroticism, addictions, compulsions, and extreme consumerism, right? Self-absorption. People they just go to the markets. And they just consume, right? Let's see. Also, it's when we think of feminine identity. So if masculine identity was disrupted, right? Masculine identity was disrupted. Feminine identity was also disrupted. In fact, it was inverted and lionized. So now the woman becomes the source of the center, the leader, etc. So this is damaging to the woman as well, because it decenters her, and she has this misunderstanding of who she is in the world. And there's no place to really know how we're supposed to be with each other. And I think this is what Scripture provides. How are we supposed to be together? How are we supposed to operate in this world together? Or how does a marriage work? How does any of this work? We need some system, right? And progressivism has provided a system that's it's a disease, in fact. Now, and then there's the racial identification, race and racialism. And racialism is just seeing everything through a racial lens. And it's pathological at this point, and it's problematic because it doesn't take in account for the full scope of life and existence and experiences, seeing everything through this racialist lens. It's very debilitating. And I'd say it's dehumanizing, because what it does is it renders us to some kind of like quality that's like an object, like your skin, right? And all of the stereotypes and meanings that go with it. It's dehumanizing, because we're more than that. So racial identification as a device, it's a device, and it's divisive, right? It creates divide in the cultural environment. This constant state of conflict, emboldened by things we have no control over, right? So we get put in this position where we're just in this constant state of referring to the differences we have as far as race and how those things affect society and politics, and we're constantly wrapped up in this, but we're preoccupied with things that we have no control over. This goes to trying to change the world and big wars overseas. We have no control over these things. So we end up getting just bogged down and preoccupied with things we have no control over. We can't change how we look. We can't change our race, right? So it's not to say that these conversations can't be had, but it's the way we're so focused on these things. And I don't believe these progressive political movements and ideologies are actually addressing the issues honestly and accurately. We have no control over our genotype, phenotype, our history, right? Our socioeconomic status, none of these things. So it just creates animosity and political unrest, and I think that's what they want. That's the whole thing. That's exactly what they need in order to sell the ideas, to put us in tribes and control us through pushes of buttons, switches, pendulums swinging back and forth. And I think these politics and these identity, kind of this preoccupation with identity, it distracts from the values of life, right? Like love, learning, relating, contributing to the world, appeasing God, seeking truth, and of course living Christ-like. It really takes us away from all of these things that I believe makes life important. And then lastly is the eros and eroticism, right? Human passions, very, very important when we think of how human passions have just been co-opted by the machine and technologies, and of course politics, right? It's sex has now become political when we think of sex positivity, right? When we think of the whole like sex worker normalizing and lionizing prostitution, the sex work is real work, the OnlyFans epidemic that's robbing young women of their dignity and their souls, turning them into like commodities on screens, selling their bodies virtually. It's the hypersexualization, right? When we think of eros and eroticism and the passions, Gen Z have and though us Xers and millennials, listen, we had this stuff too. It's just way more advanced now. It's way more pervasive. It's way more common day to day. Look at the artists today. They're just depraved. They're so depraved. It's mind-blowing how this concept of the porn brain, this pornification of the culture, right? Where I think 95%, probably even higher, of young men are, if not addicted, regularly tuning into adult content. 90+%. That's insane when you think about the effect that must have on any young man's ability to connect to a woman and perceive a woman outside of her flesh, outside of her body, outside of her use value. Use value insofar as they could have their way with them. And on the other side with women, there's all types of issues over there too, whether it be their own forms of autoeroticism, their own forms of selling their body, whether that be physically or virtually, or the disconnect from the world of eros altogether, this femceldom where girls are just tuning out completely and going somewhere else, getting involved in this dark and kind of sick world of fan fiction, right? Or these like softcore into hardcore fiction books. Girls are reading pornography. They're not necessarily watching it like young men. They're reading it. Women are more linguistic. They're more narrative based. Men are more visual. We're different, right? But we still got the same pathologies. We still got the same preoccupations with the flesh. We just have different modes of going about it. And then you get the more masculine women that are out there living in the streets like men, like hunting prey or pursuing to be hunted as if they were prey, right? This is a pathology. This is an inherently pathological type of eros and eroticism where the human passions have become the base of general social function. And it's asocial, I'd say. It's not about connection. It's the opposite. It's using people for your own personal desires. So with this hypersexualization of Gen Z, we get sex positivity. Sex work is real work. Promiscuity, prostitution normalized. Sexualized popular culture online. Everything is is related to sex. And then there's the whole demoralization of it. It's demoralizing to be constantly exposed to this stuff. Imagine being exposed constantly to these themes and even images as young as 10 or 11 years old up until your adulthood. What does that do morally? It sears the conscience is what it does. It sears it young, right? This is another thing Gen Z has experienced. And it is precisely these things that we can define the progressivist movement through these ideas. These are their ideals. These are what they hold dear. These are their tenets. So surely we can see how it's failed Gen Z. Demoralization, it takes away their foundation for truth, for morality. Right? And then there's the removal of justified shame and guilt. I say justified because shame and guilt is often used manipulatively. But when it's just, when it's righteous, shame and guilt keeps people in order. Right? That's why they want to get rid of Christianity and the concept of sin altogether, because it keeps order, keeps people in line, gives them the ability to enjoy freedom and liberty because they have parameters. Freedom can't exist without rules. Otherwise, it becomes pure chaos. And then there's the whole sexual orientations, right? Which is just materialist objectification of your body and your genitals. It's interesting, though, how it's like this preoccupation with your body is very materialistic, right? Because it only can be this whole sex thing and this whole homosexual thing is literally defined by genitals, objective, material, pieces of material. But then there's this whole abstract continuum for identity with regard to transgenderism. But then at the same time, they get that identity through the genitals, which is materials. It's inconsistent. It's contradictory. It's fluid, yet it's solid and objective at the same time. Makes no sense. And that's the thing. None of it makes sense. And this is why it's failed Gen Z, because it's done nothing but create confusion. Pure and utter confusion. All right, now let's get into two key points here. Extremism and authenticity. Very, very important parts of this. I can't help but see the constant promotion of being true to yourself. Your truth is your truth, right? Do you be true to yourself? This whole preoccupation with authenticity. So I want to talk about how the problems of authenticity as a concept, especially when it's not rooted in anything transcendent, as well as the inconsistency or contradictory nature of authenticity in a world that's insincere, in a culture that is rooted in pure absurdity, where everything's a joke, where no one can be serious, a completely unserious culture. How can an unserious culture be authentic? It's oxymoronic. And so throughout this episode, I want to go through how these things are in constant conflict and contradicts each other. And I think that's a way to describe or even define progressivism is contradictory, confusion, pathology. Now, the creepy part is this is the culture we got. This is what Gen Z has been brought up under. And I would also add, this is why a lot of Gen Z is moving to the right. This is why a lot of the culture in general is becoming more conservative. This is why a lot of people are seeking Christianity, the Bible, and religion in general, because these things are catching up. These things are catching up. So I got a bunch of clips we're going to look at to kind of support my view. Quickly here on extremism in the app generation. I want to touch on extremism before we spend a little more time on authenticity. And I have a concept, or should I say, I have a theory of extremism. Like, why? What is it? So I think about this. So with a lot of Gen Zers, and this millennials too, there seems to be this either everything is really funny and absurd and over the top. And this could be as far as comedy or humor. It also could be sexual. But there's this over the top kind of thing where everything is just like super hyperbolic and exaggerated. That tends to speak more towards a positive, right? Especially if you look at any Gen Z comedy, their humor, just this kind of ridiculous nature. It's like postmodern, it's like, or meta modern, where everything is just referencing itself. And in some cases, it's funny and it can be very entertaining and unique because it's so strange and odd. But it's an extreme if we're going to address it. Honestly, it is a type of extreme. But then you get the other side. It's a polarization. So on the other side, you get like hyper depression or severe not narcissism, but severe nihilism, like this disaffection with the way the world is and the potentials for the future. There's a whole movement online, especially on YouTube, of Gen Zers. And I do understand the attention economy has caused people to do this stuff just to make money or to create some kind of name. Unfortunately, that's what happens. Real things become commodities themselves. So there's been this new market that's opened up about Gen Zers complaining about their life. And at first it was pretty authentic, I'd say. But now when I look at it, I see people just trying to come out with these videos so they can make a YouTube channel. And this is where Gen Z's at. And it's hard because this is kind of how to survive today. So I have to also understand that part. But there's this whole thing about work and labor, and these are all true. These are all real things to complain about. You know, it's hard to survive. Work sucks. You know, pay sucks. My grandparents bought homes when they were in their 20s. I'll never own a home. Time is moving so fast. These are just different themes that I see. I have no friends. There's so many videos of people saying, you know, 28, 30 years old. I have no friends. You know, I'm a virgin. You know, I've never been on a date, never had a girlfriend, never had a boyfriend. All of these different themes that are very, very real, but they're extreme, guys. These are extreme things here. So you get this polar opposite, this dark negative side, but then this very just bright and eccentric and extroverted, hyper positive or just pure insanity when you look at some of the humor. I find it interesting that there's very little nuance in this culture. There's very little grounded, collected, nuanced, and in a sense, deep representation of this culture. Now, they may come in small little pockets of the internet. You might find several of these types of people, and I understand this isn't speaking to the whole population out there in the world. I do understand that we're talking about what we see on the internet, what we see online. And I would also argue what we tend to see online is not a good representation of reality, but also might speak to the fact that maybe the internet does attract possibly populations that are higher in neuroticism or higher in some type of asocial thing. But again, I know that could be argued against because everyone's on the internet now. That probably was a better position, say, 10 years ago. The smartphone changed that. When it was mostly tablets, or should I say laptops and desktops, it was truly the internet was a place for types. But now with smartphones, everyone's here. So maybe that doesn't work. Anyhow, I find that very interesting how there's these polar extremes. So why? Why is that? I think life in general for this generation is predominantly mediated perception opposed to experienced perception. So a mediated perception is life is through mediums or apps or devices, right? Which creates a sense of detachment. So I think the younger generation in general is living through this type of mediated experience that's giving them a sense of detachment that takes them away from direct life, that then focuses on pure information, all of these symbols, all of this like very viral stuff. And when info glut comes in, this is what McLuhan teaches is in his work, Marshall McLuhan, he says, you know, when the human is taking on so much information, it's too much information for the brain to actually register and process. So it starts to defer to or revert to pattern recognition. And what we'll see is what stands out the most. And this pushes us towards extremes. What stands out the most is going to be the things that are more stimulating, whether that be negative or positive. So I think a lot of these extremes we're seeing with Gen Z has to do with this, in that they are mainly getting their perception of life from this hyper real world, from the screens, from algorithms, from applications, from social media communities, from influencers, from people trying to sell them things, from algorithms trying to appeal to their preferences. They're not actually engaging with the real world and real people where nuance exists. And it's not this hyper influx of all these symbols and images that they could actually process. No, they're not doing that. They're actually engaging with this hyper machine. So it kind of forces them to go to this place of extremes where these are the things that tend to get their most attention. Now, there are real world things that cause, I'd say, more of the negative stuff, say socioeconomic status, loneliness, not being around a lot of people. Of course, that's going to push you emotionally towards the negative. So you might pay attention more to the negative things you see online, as well as find communities that are experiencing the same thing you're experiencing. But then also push you towards a state of escapism, where you want to escape. So you go into the pleasure. You go to the pleasure principle, pleasure industries, attention economy. I just find this extremism thing interesting. And then there's this, so it creates that type of engaging with the world creates, in my view, this type of extreme perspective of life. Everything's extreme, whether good or bad, right? So it's like high pleasure, high absurdity, or low emotions, loneliness or lowliness, and fatalism, right? And with that, we get, with the high pleasure and the absurdity and this kind of like irony culture, right, where everything's unserious and insincere. It's a type of hiding. It's hiding from being yourself because you're insecure. So you just have to always put on this facade of comedy and funny, and nothing's real, nothing's serious. This is very normal in the culture. Or you go to the other side and it's just like hyper depressive, kind of like what we saw with the emo movement with the millennials, but just way worse and not really part of some music genre or aesthetic. So with that, you get absurdity on one side, anhedonia on the other, which is basically hedonism and nihilism, which creates crisis. And this is something that I see happening with Gen Z. There's this polarization of extremes, positive and negative, that are causing this conflict because there's no middle. There's no space to really live. It's just this constant reactionary state. And it's because of the kind of extreme online experience. Now, we're all online. We all have devices. We're all interacting and engaging with screens hours a day. This is just super modernity. This is how we live now. That is less the issue than it is about what exactly is being consumed, right? There's a big difference between, say, listening to audiobooks, watching podcasts or lectures. Big difference between those things, or say creating online, literally building and developing things online. There's a big difference between that world and, say, scrolling social media, right? Arguing with people on Reddit. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a big difference between that. There's a huge difference between comparing yourself and envying others for hours a day by scrolling Instagram, or just completely rotting your brain by scrolling through TikTok, watching endless, random, detached videos of nonsense. There's a big difference between these things. So I also want to say that I'm not demonizing technology. I'm not demonizing this type of interactivity, because this is the world. This is where we're at. And it's only going to increase. Hence the importance of creating balance. That's my view. Balance. Let's not forget the world exists. Let's not forget the real world relationships and the real passions and things we have in the material world that can translate into the digital. For instance, if you're an artist, you could turn that art into something digitally. So there's definitely positives too. I don't want to make it seem like it's all horrible. So there's this lack of balance and stability with the generation. It's just so extreme and hyperbolic on either side. There's very little grounded and nuanced culture. There's no real culture of intellectualism in Gen Z. Now, you could find them. There's pockets of them. But you literally got to find these small communities, these book book communities are an example of that. Great places. Like BookTube and, all of these different places where you see young people getting back into thinking and learning. And there's a very big religious kind of culture. Not very big, but there's a growing religious culture in Gen Z. So it's not that they don't exist, but this is not where most of them are at. This is not where the attention is actually going. And these are failures by way of progressivism mixed with the technology, of course. So it's not all because of the ideology or the culture. It's definitely with the technology included. Now, let's get into authenticity. This one is really, really important here. Okay. This one's very important. Let's see. All right, so I have some clips. I want to first talk about self-esteem quickly here. And how self-esteem is kind of like, it's an old concept that's definitely not as popular. But it was a big part of my upbringing. Like in the 90s, self-esteem was like a big thing. Like it was so important people had a good sense of self-esteem. And that's kind of a bad concept because that's saying I should just feel good about myself because it's myself. So it's this very progressive view of the good outside of any real moral foundation. So good becomes just feeling good. As long as esteem is like, I feel good about myself. My whole thing needs to be, I just need to feel good about myself and then I'm a good person. That's absolutely crazy because, doing harm to others could feel good to someone, right? So I just want to like bury this idea quickly here. And I found a clip of Jordan Peterson when he was in his better days, for sure, because he's just kind of went off the deep end. But his old lectures do have some, I'd say some redeemable qualities and some decent perspectives. So I just want to play this quickly here, this little part where he discusses this idea.
Even though the measures were pretty appalling, and even though you could, model it with the Big Five. And then one of the things that happened as a consequence of that was that the whole California school system started to teach students self-esteem. It's like, what makes you think you should have high self-esteem? Like maybe you're a miserable little worm. God only knows, right? It's not the case that you should have a good opinion of yourself in every bloody situation. What if you're a bully who pounds people out in the schoolyard? Bullies, by the way, do have higher self-esteem than normal. So because it's not like they're feeling bad about themselves when they pound you, they're feeling bad about you. And the best work, the low self-esteem equals bully hypothesis, lots of people believe that. But if you read Dan Olweus, who's the world's leading authority on bullying and who's actually done something about it, what he says is that bullies have inappropriately high self-esteem, which is why they think they're in a perfectly good position to pound you out if you happen to be on the playground. So it's not like they're suffering from a, neurotic weakness of self-image. It's quite the contrary. So anyways, in the California school system, they tried to teach kids self-esteem. And, there's no evidence that you can do that first because neuroticism is actually quite hard to shift.
So neuroticism is just a way to describe negative emotions. So a neurotic type would be someone who has an exaggerated expression of negative emotions. So when you hear neuroticism, it's basically referring to negative emotions.
So, and if we knew how to treat it, well, hooray, everybody would be thrilled about that, but it's not easy. And second, there are people like, what's her name? Jean.
And Ornay, who's kind of like one of the best or the most referenced psychologists when it comes to neuroticism, would say it's about having irrational thoughts, irrational fears and anxieties. Fear and anxieties for irrational reasons that tend to be patterned in one's behavior and one's experiences day to day. Could be viewed as neurotic or neuroticism. But to make it simpler, we could look at fear and anxieties as irrational as just negative emotions, or better, irrational negative emotions. There we go.
Twenge used to be a student of Roy Baumeister's, who claims that all that self-esteem is not easy, that you can do that first because neuroticism is actually quite hard to shift. So, and if we knew how to treat it, well, hooray, everybody would be thrilled about that, but it's not easy. And second, there are people like, what's her name? Jean Twenge, she used to be a student of Roy Baumeister's, who claims that all that self-esteem training has just, made younger people like you guys more, what do you call that? Narcissistic. Yeah, because the self-esteem becomes disconnected from the actual accomplishment, because you might...
That very key point, right? The self-esteem is disconnect from the accomplishment. And that's what I was saying earlier. The self-esteem, the good, just connects or is a reflection of one's feelings, not necessarily duty or who you are as a person or what you've actually done, right? It just becomes this very ego-based thing. And I'm going to show a clip here after of Jean Twenge, the one he's referring to here, that talks a bit about narcissism, just to kind of set the record for narcissism and its relation to this new type of online culture that defines Generation Z, or the application generation, but also how the lack of any, say, transcendent belief system, moral system that can actually ground values exacerbates this problem. And that which exacerbates this problem is the progressive movement. It is this kind of culture and worldview of me, endless liberty, hedonism, pleasure, preoccupation with my identity at the expense of real social cohesion. So it's this mixture of the progressive, secularist, subjective kind of I create my own reality culture mixed with the technology.
What's her name? Jean Twenge, she used to be a student of Roy Baumeister's, who claims that all that self-esteem training has just, made younger people like you guys more, what do you call that? Narcissistic. Yeah, because the self-esteem becomes disconnected from the actual accomplishment, because you might hope, well, you'd sort of feel good. How good should you feel about yourself? Well, you might say, well, you should grant yourself the right to exist like you do everyone else. That's sort of like a basic human right. As a human being, you're valuable. And then maybe you should sort of think you're about as valuable as other people roughly think you are. That seems about right? So the right amount of self-esteem would be your perception of your value within the context of a group. It's got to be something like that. So there should be a concordance, because like maybe you need to improve, could well be. And are you going to improve if you're feeling really good about yourself? Well, the answer to that is, well, we don't know. How much misery about yourself do you have to have before you're motivated to improve yourself? None?
I even think that is a weak kind of example. Your esteem is only as valuable as the group perceives you. What if the group is crazy? What if the group is a cult and it's insane? What if it's like a sex cult? you know what I mean? So again, this is the problem with the secular view. They can't answer for these things that require a transcendent, objective, and absolute kind of moral grounds. So saying that, hey, maybe the group should help me decide doesn't help it either, because it's still rooted in man, right? It's better. I guess it's a little better to at least consider your place within the group, but also the group needs something to ground the group. The group can't just simply ground the individual, right? So this is where these secular views always run into trouble, and they're not able to answer the real problems of man and behavior and society because it's inconsistent. Now, I want to refer to a clip here of Jean Twenge, the woman he referred to. Okay, let's see what she has to say about the internet narcissism, and American culture. Let's see what she says. Interesting little clip here. By the way, this is from 2012. So the reason I really appreciate this one here is because it's speaking about issues prior to them really taking hold. Now, I have a few of her books. I'll be referencing them later. Not on this show, of course, but down the line when we dig more into some of these Gen Z issues. But 2012 is before the real issues happened. So it's interesting to see how much has changed since. And what she was talking about here pales in comparison to what we're actually seeing today, say in this kind of TikTok culture. Fascinating to see.
So what about the internet? You write a little bit about how the internet has impacted the way we see ourselves and the way in which we can interact with culture.
Overall, the internet's a great thing. And overall, social networking sites like Facebook are a great thing.
See, in 2012, it was probably very common to say that. But in 2024, I know she doesn't feel this way anymore. And I know most people would probably change their view. They say it's not necessarily an overall great thing. There's some great aspects to it, but it's done a lot more damage than good. And it's not necessarily that it's the technology's fault, but it's the nature of man. It's the fallen nature of man and his inability to put limits and parameters on his behaviors. And this is precisely what progressivism does. It absolves you from parameters and limitations, right? It wants you to believe that you can do anything you want and you can have everything you want, just as long as it feels good.
But the internet does tend to pull out narcissistic tendencies in many ways, in some cases. So the comment sections in, say, YouTube videos are just cruel, like beyond cruel sometimes. And it's because it's anonymous and it allows people to be kind of self-centered and angry in a way that's very narcissistic. And then, of course, the way some people use social networking also places that emphasis on kind of shallow relationships, and I'm going to get 1,000 Facebook friends. In real life, you're lucky to have 2 really close friends that you can confide in.
It is skewing our idea of relationships, isn't it?
Key point. It's skewing our ideas. It's skewing our idea of relationships, but it's also skewing our idea of reality. And this is prior to the applications. This is more referring to the internet and websites. So once we apply applications, the ubiquity of devices, and the extended exposure, then it starts to shape our reality, what we think is real, what we think is actually happening. It becomes the lens through which we actually see the world and other people. It doesn't just skew our ability to relate in our relationships, but it actually skews our perception of reality. And that's how you can see how things have gotten a lot darker. And I think what we see in Gen Z as a response through their behaviors and some of their gripes is evidence of that.
Narcissistic. And then, of course, the way some people use social networking also places that emphasis on kind of shallow relationships, and I'm going to get 1,000 Facebook friends. In real life, you're lucky to have 2 really close friends that you can confide in.
It is skewing our idea of relationships, isn't it?
Because it depends on what your definition of a friend is. Is it the old definition or the new definition?
What about the posting of your life, like an online journal?
Some blogs are great and they make great stories, and a lot of people can read them and learn from them. Others, you can really tell that somebody is posting it because what they're thinking is, boy, I know this is important because it's about me. And that mentality doesn't really come across in some of those sites.
How about, though, the ability to self-publish? Now we have people who can actually get out good ideas. They don't have to go through those standard gatekeeping functions.
Right.
And so maybe we actually have more good ideas out there.
That's probably true. So, any of these things are a trade-off. It is great that we can have more people expressing ideas and so on. But it also means that people then see fame as more accessible. And that isn't always a good thing to be striving for fame all the time.
Why aren't we repulsed by watching some of these videos or reading some of these things? Why don't we say, oh my goodness, I'm going to turn that off?
Well, a lot of people are repulsed by it, thankfully. But on the web and on reality TV, the way to get the most attention and thus to make the most money is to be as provocative as possible. So it really pulls for that kind of narcissistic behavior.
And this idea is what gave me the concept of normative narcissism. Is how I developed the concept is through this clear and very obvious, even early on, I was noticing how the attention economy encourages manipulation. It encourages leveraging and exploitation of people's attention and their emotions. It encourages the false self to exploit and leverage others' attention such that one could gain personal let's say profits or finances, or just attention itself, fame, right? So this is from this kind of concept of the attention economy. Normative narcissism came to me because it's obvious that narcissism is now normative in that it's it's good, right? It's expedient to be this way. You'll gain fame, you can become rich and wealthy, yet it's encouraging antisocial behavior, which I find extremely fascinating. Not just narcissistic behavior, but even antisocial, in that its ultimate, I'd say, goal and outcome is the destruction of social bonds, the disruption and destabilization of a society's networks, right? Because when we lie to each other, all we do is separate ourselves from one another.
You just have to get more and more and more outrageous in order to be watched. How is that going to long-term impact American culture?
What is that people then see fame as more accessible, and that isn't always a good thing to be striving for fame all the time.
Why aren't we repulsed by watching some of these videos or reading some of these things? Why don't we say, oh my goodness, I'm going to turn that off?
Well, a lot of people are repulsed by it, thankfully. But on the web and on reality TV, the way to get the most attention and thus to make the most money is to be as provocative as possible. So it really pulls for that kind of narcissistic behavior.
You just have to get more and more and more outrageous in order to be watched. How is that going to long-term impact American culture?
What worries me about some of those shows is there's a lot of young people who watch who do see that as normal. And my Super 16 is a good example. It's rich kids planning their 16th birthday party, and they complain when they get the $50,000 car instead of the $100,000 car, and things like this. And the average adult who watches that just is appalled and actually think it's funny most of the time. Look at how spoiled that kid is. And then usually the adult is extremely appalled then at the parent, on those shows who is facilitating this as well. But, I think the average 14 or 15-year-old, and you see this in the reaction of the kids who are at these parties, what they get on tape, the average reaction is, I'm so jealous, because they don't have the perspective to realize just how messed up that is in terms of priorities.
Right.
Very, very key. They don't have the perspective. They're immature, right? They don't have the ability to see through the behaviors. And this is another struggle Gen Z has had, being overexposed early when they're immature, when they're impressionable, overexposed to all of these symbols and these images and these messages that are actually pretty unhealthy, right? And I just think about raising kids. It's like, as parents, it's always our duty to safeguard our child's young mind from ideas that are too extreme or mature for them, right? Such that, they don't suffer any damage there. It's a big part of being a parent is vetting and, censoring all that which the child takes into its eyes and mind, and mouth and ears as well. So what you discover is, with this onslaught of the attention economy and ubiquitous computing through devices and applications, it's stepped in and plays a new role in the young person's life that in many cases supersedes the discretion or the intervention of the parent, and it becomes a new type of parent. But it also starts to shape and mold the minds of the children and the young people. And I think this is another way Gen Z has been sustained some level of damage because of this interactivity. And essentially, if, say, our culture was more conservative, more Christian, there would be more pushback. There would be parameters set that would culturally, I'd say, inspire and influence people's behavior. But see, when you're telling everyone you could do whatever you want, you could be whatever you want, you could have as much as you want. When you're telling young people this, you're setting them up. You're setting them up for failure, and this is what progressivism has done. Now, I want to go to this really good article here as we talk about authenticity, and I just want to read this part here. This is from Bo Weingard. It's from Aporia publication here. Really, really interesting thing on authenticity. Now, the reason I want to talk about authenticity is because it's become a big part of this culture, especially when we think about how social media, the false self that it kind of conjures, really takes people away from being authentic. So there is this like dearth of authenticity. So people are like striving to be authentic. I understand that, but I'm speaking to authenticity more from like this progressive kind of ideal that says you're free. It's very Rousseauian. Like you're this free, noble savage that needs to express themselves openly and be everything and all you want to be, and be your true and pure authentic self to the world. And it doesn't matter who judges you. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks, as long as you're being true to yourself. This type of authenticity. It's a type of pathology, I believe, because again, if there's no kind of moral absolute or grounds to limit and guide that authenticity, I mean, you could be an authentic serial killer, right? So it's a dangerous kind of ideal, and this is another problem with this very hyper progressive culture, is it doesn't give you any parameters outside of your own feelings. And I think it's inherently antisocial because it imposes and it infringes upon the shared society. So we see a perfect example of this authenticity is what we would see in, say, gay parades, right? Where, because I've seen them, they're disgusting in San Francisco, and you have literally naked men walking down the street. It's even sicker now. I'm not even kidding. This is real. They have kiddie pools, and it's sick how they use kiddie pools, by the way. They have kiddie pools, and this is kind of gross, but they have people that would lay in the kiddie pool whilst other individuals come and take turns peeing on them, urinating on individuals in this kiddie. It's just like the most depraved, animalistic, disgusting thing you could imagine. This kind of behavior, and I think this is what progressivism presents: is this just abject behavior that's just completely pathological and disgusting. And with that kind of like libertine, let's say exponential freedom, you could do whatever you want. This is this type of authenticity I'm getting at, where the ultimate ideal in their view is to be as free as you want to be. You could sleep with animals. You could sleep with anyone you want. You could walk around naked. You could impose on other people's beliefs, eyes, presence, space, because it's for you. It's all about you, right? This is the authenticity that I'm really trying to get at here. And I found an interesting article here that kind of touches on the importance of grounding authenticity in something outside of your own ego and your own emotions. So let's see this here. Let me pull this up. Let's do this one. There we go. All right. So I'll read through this as quickly as I can here. The misguided. Another example is the reading to children in the libraries. These what are these transvestites reading to kids and stuff. They're just being their authentic self. See, but no. What if I don't want my child to be around and spoke to by a heavy-set man with a beard and some lipstick and some tits? What if I don't want my child to see that? What if that will create some kind of pain and confusion mentally and emotionally for my child that has been brought up in a normal world that has binaries and limitations to behavior? What if I don't want that for my child? I don't care how authentic you're being. You see what I mean? Yeah. The misguided authenticity-inauthenticity dichotomy should be replaced by a more meaningful, virtuous, sinful distinction. This is key. Virtue versus sin. Righteousness, I would say. Righteousness versus sin, opposed to authenticity and inauthenticity. Are you sinful or are you righteous? Not, are you authentic or are you inauthentic? This is the difference between a more conservative or what I would call a Christian worldview opposed to a progressive worldview. Humans should strive not to conform to the characteristics of some mysterious hidden true self, but to the precepts of a transcendent moral and aesthetic standards. Whether an act is congruent with the authentic self is irrelevant, for the acts of the authentic self might lead to ugliness and even damnation, like the examples I just gave. Humans are not like rocks or rivers. They do not exist merely as they are, forever unaware of the past and future. Humans create, transcend, and overcome. Rejecting one's current self while pursuing a more noble future self is no more inauthentic than the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. Many human tendencies are wicked. Sigmund Freud argued that humans have an instinct toward destruction, and that of history of civilization was the history of a clash between eros and death. And although his heady vision of cultural conflict was more poetic than scientific, it was not far from the truth. Civilization is at war with human deviousness and depravity. That humans have an instinct toward destruction, and that the history of civilization was the history of a he just repeated himself there. Okay. To be sure, humans are works in progress, flexible and receptive to culture, but they are also evolved creatures with relatively fixed characteristics, some of which are unpleasant and some of which are evil. One of the crucial tasks of civilization is to guide and discipline, to curb the wicked and the crass, and to spur the virtuous and the refined. And for this task, the notion of authenticity is singularly unhelpful, very, very key. This is like a refutation for the progressives' authenticity doctrine. If authentic means in conformity with innate desires and instincts, in conformity with, I don't know why this thing is repeating like this. This is really weird. I don't know how this happened. It's like it wasn't like this earlier. Super weird. Okay. So many, it's weird. And I'm sure you guys see this, it's hard to read. As it often seems to, then authentic behaviors will comprise good. Okay, so if authentic means in conformity with innate desires and instincts, as it often seems to, then authentic behaviors will comprise good and wicked acts. Examples of the wicked abound, though they are controversial, because humans dislike and often reject evidence of their own depravity or blame it on external forces such as a corrupt social order that encourages violence and avarice. Avarice is just like emotionally selfish, right? Like selfishness. Yet even a cursory glance at children on a playground refutes the intrinsic nobility of human nature. Selfish and aggressive acts are not anomalies. They are commonplace. These are often subdued but never abandoned. Adults do not leave wickedness behind like an outgrown toy. So true. Original sin is ineradicable. Such a hard word to pronounce. Ineradicable. The Daily News provides endless evidence, and even the quotidian, a gossip magazine or a grisly film, evinces the power and pervasiveness of human sin. The problem for the proponent of authenticity is that he seems committed to the position that suppressing these and other sinful or antisocial desires is inauthentic. There it is. This one is it right here. This is what we see with the LGBTQ movement that wants to just impose all of their beliefs on everybody else. They see that suppressing these sinful or antisocial desires, because they're both, whether you believe or not. If you don't believe they're antisocial, if you do believe they're sinful, right? So it seems that they're committed to the position that suppressing these sinful or antisocial desires is inauthentic. It's being inauthentic to themselves, right? Requiring social coercion, which distorts the innate nature of the self, right? So they're willing to put the self over the social, and they perceive it as a type of coercion that distorts their innate nature of themselves. So it's this egoistic, flesh-based, narcissistic view that says, my personal identity matters more than your ontology, what you believe is real, as well as your space. I can impose on your space and your mind to uphold and protect my innate nature that I identify with as myself. Okay. If most humans have a deep desire to dominate others, then restraining them from acting on that desire, the problem for the proponent of the authenticity is that he seems committed to the position that suppressing. Wow, this is so strange. It's like keeps repeating these parts. Okay, maybe I'll just read the highlighted parts. It's separating it in a very strange way. I don't know how that happened. Very weird. Okay. All right. So if most humans have a deep desire to dominate others, then restraining them from acting on that desire is restraining them from expressing their true selves. Civilization becomes an affront to authenticity. Oh, there it is. Yeah, it looks like AI, right? AI wrote this. You think AI wrote this? Because I know this. This is an actual author here. It's an actual author. Maybe. Well, I don't know, man. Today, everyone is using this stuff, so it could be the case. All right, where was I at? There we go. This is such an important point here. It's Nephilim. Restraining them from expressing their true selves. Okay, civilization becomes an affront to authenticity. There we go. Civilization becomes an affront to authenticity. So the shared world that requires moral absolutes that set limitations to your animal instincts, right? Your base nature, that becomes an affront to your authenticity as yourself. This is a great example. And the reason I picked this is because I think what it does is it really shows the difference between a Christian civilization and a progressive civilization. Okay? It's the Christian civilization respects and adheres to an absolute moral foundation that transcends your authentic self, that transcends your body, that transcends your politics, that transcends your ideology, that forms a type of glue that makes society safe, predictable, and healthy, and stable, and consistent, and fruitful, right? Opposed to this progressive kind of culture that wants to put everything on the individual to do whatever they want at the expense of other people. Very big difference here. The most common response from advocates of authenticity is that the true self is innately good, but somehow muted by the invention of private property or capitalism into the exploitive self we see today. Original sin is a myth, but there was a fall after humans tasted the seductive fruit of civilization. To live authentically is to reject the superficiality and selfishness encouraged by civilization and to return to the innocent passions and joys of the primitive self. This is Rousseau put into a couple sentences. And he's like the heart and foundation of this progressive movement that says, you know what? All types of order, society, social rules, meta-narratives, religions, all of these things impose on the free and wild noble savage that needs to express himself. This is, in a sense, the root. This is the root of this kind of progressive era that has been a plague and a disease on the mind and has inherently, and I say significantly, damaged the ability for Generation Z to develop as complete and stable people. I think this culture has, along with the technology, created this situation where they have difficulty existing in the world without pain and confusion. And it is this ideology and this way of seeing the world and seeing the self that has contributed to this. But the evidence that civilization created factitious desires to dominate and subjugate, causing a relatively benign creature to become a fiercely competitive and acquisitive animal is limited, to say the least. Instead, the best evidence suggests that humans have always been competitive and acquisitive, though their capacity for accumulation was of course limited before the development of permanent settlements. Murder, rape, theft, and other iniquities are not novel behaviors, nor, for that matter, are they similar behaviors unknown in other animals. Nature is red in tooth and claw, as Hobbes would say. I believe that's referring to Hobbes. So again, what we're seeing is it always goes back to Rousseau versus Hobbes, right? nature is red in tooth and claw. That's either Hobbes or Spangler. I think that's Hobbes, actually. Humans are no exception, right? So it's straight up. We are animalistic insofar as that we are working from our base flesh. Not to say we're equal to animals in a Darwinian sense, but we all work from the flesh. That's why we need spiritual, transcendent parameters to give us guidance, right? And limitations to that flesh. Thus, the claim that the authentic self is free from wicked desires because those desires are socially created is not tenable. And the version of authenticity that its proponents end up espousing is suspiciously artificial, relying as it does upon a fictitious and quintessentially romantic view of human nature, Adam and Eve without the fall. Wow, I love it. It's really on point. Sorry for that. I know that took a little while, but I just think this is important and it supports what I'm really trying to get at here, at least from a philosophical position, right? Referring to the importance of differentiating the self from the society, but also creating some type of parameters for cohesion such that a society can exist. You can't just say everyone could do whatever they want to do. And unfortunately, Gen Z has been given a world that says just that. And they've also been given these devices and these machines and these messages and symbols and images that are very unhealthy. So not only are they seeing unhealthy behaviors that are normalized day to day, but they don't have the right parameters and limitations to know which ones are good, which ones are bad, and how to go about living within a world presenting all of these images and symbols. It's very, very unfortunate. Very, very unfortunate. Now, let me go to some more clips here. Okay, let me pull this up here. Here's an example of this. This is Lil Uzi Vert. And I do understand he was probably high as a kite when he said this. He's not necessarily an articulate young man. He tends to be high most of the time he's on camera, and he knows he's on camera, so that's going to change his response to the question or his answer. So he's going to, in a sense, be inauthentic in that way, but also maybe he is being authentic because his answer sounds about right. But the reason I'm showing you this is kind of the message that we get, for this young generation.
Oh, for the youth? Yeah. For all the kids and
So he's like, do you have a message for the youth?
Oh, for the youth? Yeah. For all the kids and stuff? Yeah. Just keep being as weird as possible because all the weird boys got all the money.
Okay. And what's your favorite song on JT's album?
So just keep being weird. And then again, first it goes from this very authenticity view, right? Because be yourself, be very weird, first off. And I think what he means by be weird is don't be afraid to be yourself, right? Don't be afraid to be yourself. Now, I'm not suggesting we should be afraid to be ourselves. My view is we need a proper foundation to define and perceive ourselves, to give ourselves value. Yourself isn't valuable just because, you have money or you take on pleasures in the world. Of course, we're inherently valuable through God, right? But what happens when you don't have a system to provide that? What happens when the system is, as he said here, well, the weird guy's got all the money. So what happens when the only real parameters or limitations or foundations you really have are appeals to income, appeals to vanity, to beauty, social status, fame, money, right? This is what Gen Z has been given. This is what the progressive view props everything on, the material, right? So just, I'm not saying we should be afraid to be ourselves, but we should consider what the self is. And how do you gauge its value? Not necessarily the transcendent value that comes from God, but its social value, because that's what we're getting at here. When people consider their self and how they judge themselves and the value, they're not considering, oh, how does God see me? They're considering how do other people see me. We tend to define ourselves by way of our social relationship or representation. We tend to define ourselves how other people see us. or at least we use other people's views and I guess perceptions of ourselves to give our self value, which I think is unhealthy, right? So in that kind of progressive view, it's going to be like, well, what is everybody else like? Yeah, the ego. Everybody else likes money. Everybody else likes fame, virality, the glitz and the glamour. That's what everybody else likes. So let me root myself and my identity in that, but let me exploit my behavior and be weird because that seems to be what everybody else is doing. So we get into the mimicry. Right now it's all about mimicking, and this is another thing you see in Gen Z. It's very derivative culture. Constant mimicry. And just absurdity. Just very strange internet behavior. Here's a good example of this kind of like strange TikTok-y internet behavior. I thought this was just a good example.
Oh, U.S. government of America, you've made a big mistake. You think you can take away our app? Well, we are the most powerful generation that there ever was. We are Generation Z. We won't let TikTok fall. We will rise above it all. We will save TikTok.
Okay, I can't take any more of that. I just wanted to show you just, it's a strange kind of ether that these children are floating in. And everything just becomes performative and strange and weird. And I like weird, I like eccentric kind of stuff, but it's just out there. And it's very detached and removed from general senses of normalcy, man. It's like, I don't know. And then there's this whole other side where parents and older people are discovering that young men are falling into this deep end, right, of addiction, etc. Check this one out.
Someone answer this question. What is going on with emerging adult white males between the ages of, say, 18
and I don't know why she put the white males on there. I mean, this is happening to all males, but anyways.
And 25 to 30. I ask you this because most of the clients that come to me have young adult white males between 18 and, say, 30, and they are sleeping all day, gaming all night, hiding from their parents, hiding from the world, smoking a lot of weed. They don't want to grow up. And I don't want to use inflammatory language, but I have seen so much of this in the last 18 months that I would say this is an epidemic. And I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a complex issue. I think it has to do with the attraction of gaming and the escape of that. I think it has to do with losing faith in the world and the way it's going at the moment. And I think in some ways we all hit that 20s and we're like disillusioned with the fact that we have to grow up and like kick it into gear and take responsibility for ourselves. And maybe we don't want to do that. But why is it so much more difficult these days for this generation?
Perfect clip here to present a real world example of a concerned parent of an older generation that's noticing there's a change, a rapid change, a shift, right? That I think really took hold post 2020, right? So perfect clip to demonstrate what I'm building here as far as the groundwork and constitution of this dilemma that she's referring to. In my view, it is a mixture of politics, of ideology, progressive politics and ideology that takes the young person away from all the foundational things that give them meaning and purpose in life, taking all of those roots away from them, but then convincing them that you can do whatever you want. You could, as long as you feel good about yourself, that's all that matters. So you're giving people this completely delusional way of addressing the world and themselves. whilst you're taking out all the foundations that give them morality, purpose, meaning, relationship. You're taking out the foundations and the roots, but then you're giving them this delusional perception of who they are in relation to the world. And then you're giving them 24/7 access to these hypertronic technologies and like all types of stimulation, from video games to, social media, with all of these people they're comparing themselves to. That's how we get here. And this is not exhaustive. Okay, there's definitely other aspects to this, but I just wanted to put that out there. Gosh, I have so much more, and we're not gonna be able to get to it all. So we'll be finishing these on the next. It's Thanksgiving is coming up, by the way, so I'm gonna take some time off to see family. And I'll be back in a couple weeks. So if you guys don't see any streams for a couple weeks, that's why. I'm going to do some real world relating with loved ones and the physical environment while the holiday season is here. And then when we come back, I mean, we're going to be diving in that December into the new year. And then we'll be returning to all of these. But let's see. Yeah, we could save some of this stuff because it's just have way too many here. Let me show. I have some slides. Let me show some slides. Okay. Kitty suit. It does seem that way, doesn't it? It does seem that way, but I guess it's the timing, the timing and everything. I mean, realistically, aside from maybe Christmas, Thanksgiving is like at least for me, that kind of holiday where you do something, you go somewhere, or you just stay home and have people over. This year, I'm going to travel, so forgive me. Okay, so extremism, right? Authenticity, being true to oneself, right? Very narcissistic, I'd say. And also it's like accountable to self always and to others sometimes. It's like it's inconsistent and egoistic. So when you think of like, say the queer community or whatever, LGBTQ, they're like so sincere and respectful to each other, right? Within their progressive worldview. But say to a Christian or to a conservative, they have this disdain and this utter disrespect, and they just treat them like straight garbage, like just pure hatred. So there's no consistency. It's like you're not really being a good person in that sense, right? So, but again, they're being authentic to themselves, right? Very, very interesting. So extremist views of the self and progressive is like this boundless liberty, which really is built out of Rousseau. And with that, you get normative narcissism and abject hedonism, the fruits of progressivism. And these are the two worst things for any young generation. So imagine a Gen Z who came into the world with all of these amazing toys and all of this stimulation. I mean, these games are amazing today, guys. That's why I don't play a lot of games, because I'll be stuck trying to play these things, man, because they're just so visually amazing. And the world building and everything, really, really wild stuff. Like, it's easy for someone to get wrapped up in these things. So the last thing these kids need is this, and this is what they were born into the world with, these amazing technologies that have this command over their psychology. But then you have this very narcissistic attention economy that encourages and incentivizes narcissistic behavior, right? And with that, you have this abject hedonism of progressivism that says the best thing in the world is pleasure. So imagine what that does to a young person, where you're brought up into a world saying you could be whatever you want, you could believe whatever you want about yourself. It doesn't have to have any moral element to it. It just does it feel good to you. But then put them in a world where it pays to be narcissistic, right? And then tell them the only thing that really matters is feeling good and getting pleasure and avoiding pain. And anytime you see pain, correct for it. Zero risk. There should be no risk in life. Everything should be safe and pleasurable. And then give them just like very distractive technologies. It's almost demonic when you think about that. It's so demonic to consider. And again, this is why a lot of young people are getting back to some truth. They're getting back to some semblance of, I'd say like objectivity and something that transcends this world of ego and pleasure and distraction. Let's see. I want to read a little bit from this book here, the application generation. We'll come back to those. I want to read a little bit from this as we wrap up here. This is a really good book for anybody interested in just, kind of a very easy read. It's a lot of surface. It's not super deep. It's not necessarily academic, but it's a very good piece on some of the basic ideas we talk about here. And some of the bigger issues that Gen Z faces. It doesn't go near as deep as I'd like it to. It misses a whole lot of things, but it is a good kind of like start for anyone interested in some of these ideas. So yeah, progressivism, failed Gen Z. These are 6 issues that I have seen over the years in my research, through my research. So there's a weak-willed, right? Like a weak will, a brittle mind, and this is generally speaking. I understand there's many Gen Zs out there that this doesn't apply to them at all, but they're the outliers, is my point. And millennials have their issues that are a little different. Us Gen Xers have our issues that are a little different. We all got issues, but I'm focusing on Gen Z because they are the future. They're deciding so much of our future, and they lead culture. The youth always lead culture, so we have to be honest about that. So there's the weak will, the brittle mind, the emotional underdevelopment, and there's the socially inept, and it's a mediated culture, right? And it's an extreme culture. It's a culture of extremes. And as I tried to mention earlier, and I'll be fleshing this out a little better as we go on, it's a culture of extremes based on the exaggerated exposure to concepts and ideas, images, messaging, symbols through scrolling, and there's just this like endless constant information, more information than any human has ever received in like their life. A young Gen Zer who scrolls maybe a few hours a day gets more information than people hundreds of years ago ever received in their life, right? It's really, really interesting when we consider that, like the level of information glut. And this creates extremes such that we start to focus on things. We become so desensitized. We need extreme stimulation, whether that be positive or negative, sexual, comedic, or depressive, right? It takes something very extreme to move us now because of this. So the weak will is this like hive-mindedness. And we see this through the progressive, especially through the political stuff, the activism. It's just hive-minded. It's no real thinking is going on. And that has to do with a weak will. And I think the will comes from this inhibition we see in the generation where they're timid, they don't have a lot of confidence. And I think confidence, well, I'm sure, confidence comes from experience in the world. Confidence comes from facing reality. Confidence comes from taking risks. Confidence comes from failure. Confidence comes from experience and trial and error. Confidence comes from putting yourself in situations that are very uncomfortable and overcoming the uncomfortable feeling. Confidence comes from practice. What if you don't practice? Life is about practice, whether that's speaking, doing, playing, creating, making. If you're not practicing, you're not going to build confidence. So when there's this detached kind of spectator-like culture we see through the devices, through the Gen app, the app Gen. It's a lack of actual application. It's a lack of practice, real-world experience. Everything is mediated. It's a detached voyeurism, spectatorship. This imbues a type of insecurity on the whole generation for the most part. It's rational. How am I going to be secure about something if I haven't done much? How am I going to know how to walk up and talk to a girl when I've never really even done that? How am I going to have a long, fruitful, enjoyable conversation with someone when I've barely even done that? You know, the whole idea of face-to-face is pretty uncommon, actually. Yes, no excuses. Face-to-face interaction and conversation. Going places. Challenging yourself physically. Right? Going to different types of environments. All of these things. It builds a type of foundation for one's sense of self, which develops security. So if there's this inhibition, your will's not going to be very strong. Right? And it's in the derivative nature of things. Copycat, memes, memetics, mimicry, mirroring, right? The derivative nature of the internet culture, the derivative nature of screens, the derivative nature of reposting, copy pasta. These are ways of life today for a generation. And then the brittle mind has to do with outsourced thought and mimicry. Right, Google it. You know, now everyone's using all of these different applications. People are going to Instagram and TikTok for news. They're not thinking about stuff. They're just literally absorbing information. And then the whole mimicry thing. And then emotionally underdeveloped, heightened sense of immaturity. If you have no experience, you're not going to mature. When you're not challenging yourself, when you're not taking risks, you're not going to mature. Jonathan Haidt in his works really focuses on the risk-taking element, how important it is for young people to take risks in life. And when you have a very safe space, snowflake, quote-unquote, type of culture that doesn't take risks and avoids all forms of pain and lives in a bubble, they're not going to develop emotionally. They're not going to develop security. Confidence. And then there's the mediated aspect of it, which I think is the most important. We become codependent on devices and mediated network systems to form our relationships and to maintain our relationships. I'm going to read some little excerpts here from this book just to kind of shed some light on that. And then, of course, we already covered the extremes. So let me jump into this here. Let's see. One possibility is that the social media platforms like Facebook make us feel lonely because they create the impression that our friends are hanging out with a greater number of more exciting people and having more fun than we are, right? So it's this false sense of reality, false sense of life that we become envious of as we watch others and live vicariously through their images and their curated experiences. We've also heard from young people that they spend hours looking at the achievements of peers whom they know only through Facebook, and that this voyeuristic activity makes them feel both competitive and inadequate. This is on page 102 of Gardner and Davis's The App Generation. Though apps allow us to perform a multitude of operations, they may not be well suited to support the kind of deep connection that sustains and nourishes relationships. Yeah, FOMO, that's another big one. The Dream Detective, yeah. And so this type of interactivity, it's not able to sustain deep connections, and it doesn't really have the ability to address complex feelings. It only could address the surface, and I'll show that to you here in a second. So when you're talking to a person face-to-face, because you are having an active exchange of information, it makes what you say more meaningful. So face-to-face conversations, presence, makes what's being said a lot more meaningful because, and we've talked about this on the Patreon and the locals when we were doing the this idea of interpersonal relating opposed to online and offline human relating. It's what's important about the face-to-face or in-person or presence is it's taking in sensorially a whole lot of different experiences. You're seeing the person's physical form. You're taking on facial expressions, body movements. There's a whole lot of data, a whole lot more data that you're taking in. And you're also, it's called intersubjectivity. You're also dealing with them looking at you. And it's this back and forth kind of social dance we do in person that creates meaning in our interaction that is stripped down when it's turned into a digital form. It's stripped down to the point of maybe visual and audio only, or just text even when we're texting. So this makes a big difference in meaning as far as the communication goes. An important quality of deep relationships is the vulnerability required from those involved. So when you grow up without these types of face-to-face experiences, you're losing out on the intimacy and the vulnerability that's required to connect to people. Okay. By bathing their actions and interactions in a wash of sarcasm, young people distance themselves both from their actions and from other people. So this speaks to this idea of sarcasm and sardonic behavior, irony, all of these things, insincerity, this unserious nature. What it does is it's a form of hiding. You're hiding yourself, but you're also distancing yourself from people. So just the definitive kind of features of Gen Z internet culture is asocial. So when you see that, it's like it makes so much sense why there's a lot of anguish and pain and confusion and sadness and anxiety and worry and depression, because they're missing all of these fundamental social bonds and experiences. And the lack of emotional risk is very, very important. So an important quality of deep relationship is the vulnerability required from those involved. It's uncomfortable to confront another person directly with one's thoughts and emotions. But taking that emotional risk is what brings us close to others. Or should I say, taking that emotional risk is what brings us closer to others. We share the worry of scholars and citizens alike that communicating through a screen instead of face-to-face largely removes the need to take emotional risks in our relationships. So the screens, the constant digital communication takes away the emotional risk of face-to-face, of presence, right? This creates a safe space. This gives people the ability to misrepresent who they are, their self-representation, right? This gives them the ability to manipulate or to just hide or to be mean and cruel even. Right? After all, it's easier to plan out what we want to say, share it from a distance, and thereby avoid having to experience the discomfort of facing another person's unfiltered and often unexpected reaction. Heavy. Apps, by the way, for perhaps not just by the way, are the ultimate filter. We use apps to filter out people instead of dealing with them and engaging in a pure sense. Now, again, it isn't to say that virtual communities and interactivity texting are inherently bad, but it is bad when it becomes the rule, when it becomes the only way or the predominant way people interact. That's when it becomes bad. And it's bad for Gen Z because this is what they were born into the world to do. At least this is what they were born into the world with, as far as their environment. Okay. Online, the actions of public figures are transformed instantly into derisive memes and circulated widely. The addition of witty hashtag at the end of tweet empties it instantly of any seriousness. So that was just an idea of how everything is just, even serious matters just become memes and cartoons that are passed around and then forgotten. So all of these different kinds of actions online more and more atrophy our ability to connect, but even our ability to think deeply about things, because everything is so quick and passed around. And for very like flesh-based, ego-based, narcissistic reasons, for pure attention or for likes, you know, or for what have you. So everything becomes like this very quick and rushed pursuit of narcissistic supply. It's like everyone's trying to get the Scooby snacks, you know, and in this whole kind of rapid process of collection, it takes us away from actually thinking about things thoroughly and deeply, and having a type of ability to reflect on ideas and actually connect with people. We're not even connecting with the ideas anymore, right? It's just everything becomes a joke, a meme. By turning everything into a joke, youth risk nothing because they make nothing of themselves vulnerable. Yet vulnerability is precisely what's needed to connect with other people in an honest and meaningful way. So important here. So I just wanted to read those couple things there, because what we see is, you know, and I think that's why a lot of people are seeking just normal people on the internet that are interesting, because people want to see vulnerability, intimacy. They want to see realness. You know, they don't want to see all the jokes and the irony and the, you know, the fakeness, everyone hiding behind comedy. It's fine to be funny. Yeah, everything needs a little humor, I would think. Nothing should be too serious. But there has to be some seriousness too. There has to be. There has to be some nuance, some complexity, some depth, right? But we're at a point now where the attention needed to even experience that is hard to find, at least in the younger generation. Thankfully, long-term or long-form content is becoming more popular, but we'll see how that goes. So this is a thing here. There's a problem of equating communication with connection, right? They're not the same. So Gen Z has been sold this idea of communicating through device and through social media and applications, etc., as a new form of connecting with friends. You're connecting with friends. You're connecting with friends. No, it's not the same. It's communicating, right? But a computer can communicate. An artificial intelligence algorithm can communicate with other artificial intelligence algorithms. Have you seen AIs have conversations with each other? It's really interesting. There's no connection. There's no life. There's nothing there. It's just information bouncing back and forth through logic. That's how a lot of humans are operating today, right? So this idea of communication online is actually detached. It's sarcastic most of the time. It's very sardonic. It's unserious, just generally speaking. These are some general themes we find, right? And it's surface, superficialities when it comes to feelings and ideas, right? Emotions and logic. Like emotion and logic, ideas and feelings become elements of these, right? Detached, sarcastic, sardonic. And then connection, actual connection, requires intimacy. It requires vulnerability, not worrying what others are going to think. Willing to be upfront and honest, or at least willing to be open, not necessarily hiding. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you're just put your heart on your sleeve and you just be purely transparent. I think that's crazy to do on the internet, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Everything isn't a game. Everything isn't a joke. And I think the number one thing you see with the Gen Z streamer culture, like when we talk about Kai Cenat and Aiden Ross, all these guys, it's just purely this. It's purely this. It's nothing but this. That's all it is. It's unserious. It's sarcastic, sardonic, perverted, right? It's detached. It's surface level. Nothing is necessarily serious. Everything is scripted. Like pretty much everything is scripted. It's kind of crazy to think that young people watch this stuff for hours and hours and hours a day, every day. And they follow these people and they create these parasocial relationships with these just total clowns that are on the internet rotting their brains and their lives. But real connection, intimacy, vulnerability, emotional risk, right? It can be serious. It can be sincere. Right? There's deep complexities when it comes to the feelings and emotions and the ideas. So there's a big difference between communication and actually connecting. See, this technology and this culture allows for mass and hyper communication, but not necessarily connection. So what happens when a generation has lived their life for the most part only communicating and rarely connecting? This is where you get the problems we're dealing with. All right, so we get a decentered, dehumanized, and dissociated and deracinated. 4 Ds. Progressivism has decentered the generation culturally and philosophically. They've taken away their meta-narratives that we would get through Christianity. They've taken away their cultural kind of foundations for who they are by creating a culture that defines itself through memes and virality and popular consumer products or viral movements, or applications. People who just live through TikTok. Right? So they've been decentered culturally and philosophically. They have no ground to really stand on for meaning and purpose. Everything becomes purely pleasure, purely political. They've been dehumanized. And we all have suffered these things, by the way, but again, we're focusing on Gen Z. Dehumanized through technology, where we're not actually communicating, or we're not actually connecting, we're just communicating information. You can communicate with a machine. You can't connect with a machine. Okay, big difference. So this communication solely has technologically dehumanized the way we interact and the way we live in the world. And it's dissociation, right? This dissociated nature socially, where people could probably count on their hands how many times they've had conversations that lasted more than 5 minutes in public with strangers or friends. All right. And deracinated. History, meta-narrative. No roots. Deracinated. We've been uprooted. The only real culture or history that a lot of the younger ones have today is the internet. They have no references for history, their lineage, or meta-narrative, a storyline or narrative for how they came to be. It's like this kind of history erases, or the internet erases history. It erases narratives. It makes everything ever present. Anything can be looked up at the click of a button. It's really unfortunate, but this is pretty much what happens. So we're going to save this abstention and temperance. I had a bunch of future solutions, but we'll save that. I got a lot of stuff on that. I got some clips on that. I went far, not too far over, but we went a bit too far. So fear and loathing in supermodernity, right? Fear and loathing. A lot of this in the culture. A lot of this in the generation, right? Disaffection, depression, worrying about the future. And just all out fear. Fear of other people. Fear of what people think. Fear of being judged. Fear of not fitting in, right? Fear of not properly adhering to the newspeak. Fear of being canceled, right? Fear of the next disease that the government's going to lie to you about. So much fear, we got to medicate ourselves, right? This constant state of a need for protection and safe spaces. Fear of upsetting, fear of disappointing someone, fear of misgendering, or fear of hurting someone's feelings. I guess only people that agree with your worldview, that is, because you don't fear at all hurting feelings of, say, a Christian, right? Or a conservative or something. It's just very inconsistent with it all. Yes, let's see. Let's save some of this stuff. So really, these main 3 things here have really damaged the generation's ability to live and address reality and actually live fruitful lives. They've been consumed with identity politics, in politics in general, as well as racialism, which is part of the identity politics, but pleasures, right? This hypersexual culture that has unfortunately preoccupied them with, I mean, imagine a young kid, like I said earlier, a kid 8 or 9, 10, 11 years old, being exposed to some of this sexual content and interacting with it throughout their life because they have the access to the tools to do so, you know, a phone in their pocket. And just the inconsistency of authenticity and performativeness of the culture. So it's like, oh, just be yourself, be authentic, yet everyone's performing. Everyone's, you know, all of their behaviors are deriving from some meme or something. They're copying some kind of like standard, or they're copying some model, some cookie cutter behavior. They're copying some aesthetic, yet we're supposed to be authentic. Everyone's avoidant, and deceptive, and insincere, and unserious, but, you know, be authentic, be your true self. I guess my point is true. There's, in this culture, there's no way to account for what is true because anyone can have their truth. So then there's no truth at all. Right? It's just wild. Anyhow, I appreciate you guys. I'm gonna get myself out of here. And I will see you guys when I get back. Let's say second week of December. We'll be back to our normal schedule and everything else as we get ready for this. Gosh, this is 2025, man. It's already here, man. Yeah, authenticity is hard to find now. Barry, good to see you, by the way. Dilly, good to see you. Everybody else, Dizloot. Everybody in the chat, appreciate you guys, man. It's hard, and that's the thing. You know, when you don't have models, when you don't have foundations, when you can't account for meaning and purpose and value and truth, I mean, yeah, there's going to be no justification to be authentic. Everything becomes a battle, a competition, right? It's who can get the most views, right? Who can, you know, that's really what it comes down to today, actually. Who can be the most famous? It's all about fame, really. It's really sad. So, yeah, see you guys soon. Love you all. Peace and blessings to you all. When in the show is always by saying all praises to the Most High God. In Jesus' name. Amen. And shalom.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street. There's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.